So we're holding on 42b, and the Gemara was talking about number one, the difference between Shabbos and other days of and regular days, mundane days. Shabbos, the custom was that people would drink wine, and person is kaveh suda on wine. He establishes a meal on wine, and so in that case, the Gemara mentioned that the wine would be exempted when you're drinking wine before the meal. It exempts the wine after the meal, and so on. That would apply to Shabbos, but not necessarily to a regular day. Now, this really is maybe a little applicable in a place like in France, where they do drink wine as part of their meal. When they drink wine as part of their meal, so it's possible when if they have wine before the meal, they are expecting that cup of red wine during the meal, because that's part of their tradition, that's part of the way of life. However, let's say here someone offered you a little wine before the meal, and it's you're probably not expecting to have wine during the meal. It's not necessarily, just because they waiting for the table to get set or something, and there's some wine, and they're offering everyone a cup of wine. Maybe it's not necessarily a sign that it's really going to include what's coming next. Additionally, this applies maybe even on Shabbos and Yom Tov, places where people are very poor, and so even though they have wine for Kiddush, could be they're not expecting, if the custom is never to have wine during the meal, so it could be that they're not, it's totally not expected, not part of the meal, because they hardly have enough wine for Kiddush. So they're not expecting to have wine during the meal, and therefore, if you decide to bring out wine during the meal, you would require possibly a new bracha. Let's see, we have two questions here. I don't know who's first. Robert.
Thank you, Rabbi. I just realized when you said red wine, I never thought there was a differential between red or white wine. So maybe, I'm out to lunch about that, but maybe you can enlighten me about that in any case.
I believe that in France, they give precedence to red wine,
right.
And that's the wine that they have during the meal.
Right.
Although, what is interesting is, according to Jewish law, white wine is actually more preferable.
Really? Never knew that.
Believe it or not, it has some precedence.
Okay. Because my whole life it's always been red wine for Kiddush.
So red because I was talking.
I understand that, right? But that's been my whole life's experience is red wine. Okay, good to know.
Yes, Simone.
Yeah, when you use the phrase "before the meal," are you saying that means they've washed on bread and eaten bread and there's a meal, or are you saying bread is not involved, they're just eating something? So I'm not quite sure what situation we're talking about when we say before the meal.
It's a very good question you're asking. The reason it's such a good question is Tosfos talks about it, the Rush talks about it, and it actually seems to be an argument between them. What we're dealing with, the wine before the meal, is it after you've washed already? And one of the cases that this deals with is if you want to have malava malka, you're going to eat the meal after Shabbos. They call it malava malka. For those that aren't aware of it, it's the meal after Shabbos, and you're reciting Havdalah. Is that Havdalah that you're reciting on the cup of wine? You're reciting the prayer on the end of Shabbos called Havdalah on a cup of wine. Is that going to be similar to Kiddush? And will that exempt the entire meal afterwards? Now, what are we dealing with? Did you wash for bread before you recited the Havdalah? If you did wash for bread before you recited the Havdalah, then Taisva says there's reason to say he feels that should exempt any wine during the meal. And how could you wash before Havdalah? You could wash for bread before Havdalah. The reason is because the Havdalah is a necessity in order to eat. You're not allowed to eat before Havdalah. So therefore, you would be allowed to wash for bread before Havdalah, and then recite the Havdalah, and then have the bread. And so you're sort of, it's semi part of the, it's sort of part of the meal that you're going to have the Havdalah as part of this Malava Malka meal, and it should cover the wine in the meal. Tosfos does mention that others argue with him and say that just because you recited a bracha on Havdalah, but the Havdalah is not intrinsically connected to the meal afterwards. Havdalah you're doing for a mitzvah. And therefore, if you recite Havdalah and you're going to have a meal after Havdalah, you would need to recite a Borei Pri Hagafen a second time on wine during the meal, even though you washed before, because the Havdalah bracha possibly is part of a mitzvah bracha to end Shabbos. And the meal element of it, it's not intrinsically connected to the meal afterwards. Kiddush, on the other hand, there's more reason to say that it's intrinsically connected to the meal afterwards. And therefore, when you say the Borei Pri Hagafen on the Kiddush, that should exempt the meal afterwards. The only problem is that the Kiddush, you didn't really wash before, except the German Jews, they wash before Kiddush. They wash their hands before Kiddush. So the Kiddush is sort of like part of the meal already. But the Rosh says it doesn't matter. Even if you have the wine before the meal, before you start, before you wash, it still should exempt the wine during the meal afterwards. So for example, in this scenario where you're having a meal with wine after Havdalah, so Tosfos himself says, well, if you wash first, it should cover the wine. The Rosh says, even if you didn't wash first, it should cover the wine. And Tosfos brings another view that says that even if you did wash first, it doesn't cover the wine. So we've got a lot of different opinions here. And but the question that you're asking basically is connected to these different views, because according to Tosfos, the way he's understanding it is that you're having the wine before the meal, but it's really you've started the meal, so to speak, already. According to the Rosh, you really have not started the meal at all, but it's appetizer before the meal. So what comes out from this is that it sort of is connected to the custom of the day, the custom where you are, or connected to what you have in mind. If you're having in mind to have, that it should cover the wine later, that is a important factor. And if the tradition is to have wine during the meal, more wine during the meal, that's an important factor as well. These two factors play a role when it comes to reciting a new bracha or relying on the bracha that you recited earlier. But what we do have in our Gemara seems that if you recited the bracha before the beginning of the meal or before the meal, it for sure will exempt the wine that one drinks during the meal, because the wine that's before the meal is connected to drinking wine as a pleasuresome element of your celebration. Drinking wine during the meal is a lesser significance. It's of lesser significance because all it is to allow your food to be digested. So the wine during the meal carries lesser significance than the wine before the meal or the wine after the meal. And the wine during the meal, being that it's of lesser significance because it's just like a means to digest the food, it's not an end in and of itself. So because of that, the Gemara had a question: will it exempt the wine after the meal? if you're going to drink, if you didn't drink wine before the meal, and now you're having wine during the meal, which you're drinking for purposes of digestion, is that going to exempt a more significant wine that you're going to have after the meal, which maybe it can't exempt because that's much more significant? And that's what the Gemara had a question. The Gemara said there were different opinions, and we had Rav and Rav's students, and we mentioned that it seems like Rav might have changed his mind afterwards because his students all followed the opposite view. But this was a discussion: would the wine during the meal exempt the other wine that's later? However, what is clear is that the wine before will definitely exempt the wine during the meal, even though it's a different purpose, but it's less significant, and therefore it for sure would be exempted. And the wine that you have before the meal will exempt the wine during the meal, because this is a very important wine you're drinking for the purpose of drinking, and the wine during the meal is really just a lesser significance. It's a wine that a person is drinking for just for digestion. So the Gemara brought these different views. Tosfos over here mentions that it seems like the halacha should follow the students of Rav, because whenever we have an argument, Rav Sheshis and Rav Nachman, so the halacha follows Rav Nachman in monetary laws and Rav Sheshis in laws of prohibition, things that are permitted and prohibited. So monetary laws would be Rav Nachman, but Rav Sheshis would be laws like laws of Brochos, laws of what's permitted, what's permissible, what's prohibited, and that would be Rav Sheshis. So we would follow Rav Sheshis here. And then even though we have an issue because Rav in this debate, we have Rav's opinion, and we have the students of Rav. What do we have here? We have Rav says Potter, it exempts it. Rav Kahana says it's not. Rav Nachman says it exempts it. Rav Shesha says it doesn't exempt it. Rav Huna, Rav Yehuda, and all the students of Rav say it doesn't exempt it. So now we normally follow Rav's view when it comes to these type of laws. On the other hand, we normally follow Rav Shesh's view when it comes to these type of laws. But Tosfos says that here we have all the students of Rav arguing on him. It seems like they must have heard such a teaching from Rav, and therefore we would follow that. Now, Tosfos does say something also very important, and that is that nowadays we don't really have wine after the meal. The wine that we drink after the meal is never really after the meal. It's still part of the meal, because we don't really end our meal at a certain time. We don't pull away our tables. We don't do all that stuff. It's not over till it's over. When we're eating, we're constantly thinking we're going to have more food. Until the meal is over, our mind is always that there might be more food coming. We might change our mind. We might have more food. We might be pulling out more food, and therefore we never really think in our mind that we're ending our meal. And therefore, Tosfos says that because of that, there isn't such a situation where wine during a meal would be needed to exempt wine after a meal, because there is no wine after the meal. Even if you drink wine after the meal, it's called part of the meal because you never finished your meal, because we continuously may pull out something else, and therefore the practicality of this law is not. It's not so. It doesn't seem so like it ever happens. It's very rare that it would happen that you would have wine after a meal, because we don't really end the meal unless you wash mayim achreina, maybe, or you know that would maybe be a. Tosfos before seemed to say that would be the end of the meal, but who's going to bring out wine after that? You're not supposed to take lenatilas yodayim's bracha. You're supposed to say the bracha right after the natilas yodayim, and if you don't wash, then it would be when you say havlan v'nivrich. So basically, it's the meal's not over till it's really over. Now, I mentioned that there were these two views in Tosfos as to the bracha on the wine before. Will it exempt the wine during the meal? And I mentioned to you that there is the view of Tosfos that it should exempt it if you washed, then you're having the meal. You washed, you had wine, then you have the meal. So the wine before the meal exempts the wine during the meal, even though we're dealing with Kiddush and Havdalah. Now, Kiddush is easier to understand. Kiddush, you need to have Kiddush with a meal afterwards. If you go to Shul and they're having a Kiddush there, and you listen to the Kiddush in Shul, and you say, okay, now I'm going home. I'm on a diet. I'm going to head home. You would need to recite Kiddush again at home, because the Kiddush in Shul is not going to be a valid Kiddush for you unless you eat a meal with it. What a meal consists of is either a cup of wine, 4 ounces, three ounces plus, or a olive size of mezainis, of cake, cookies. You need to eat something with the Kiddush. But if you just say, oh, I heard Kiddush, I'm all set, that doesn't work. Even if you had a little wine with it, maybe you had a little of the Kiddush wine, that you did not fulfill the mitzvah of Kiddush. Kiddush needs to be with a meal. Now, the meal doesn't have to be a big meal. It could be an olive size of cookies or cake or zainis, or it could be a cup of wine, 3 ounces plus of wine, or or if you washed on bread, that's sure good enough. Washed and had an olive size bread, but the definitely to just hear Kiddush and to have a little wine with it, you did not fulfill Kiddush. So in order to fulfill Kiddush, you need to have a meal. So when you drink the wine at the Kiddush, that wine of Kiddush is interconnected with the meal that's served afterward, that you're eating afterwards. And therefore, the wine of Kiddush for sure should exempt the wine during the meal. However, the wine of Havdalah is not interconnected to a meal afterwards. Yes, there's a mitzvah to have a lava malka, it's a mitzvah to have, it's a special thing to escort the Shabbos queen, but it's not interconnected. It's not intrinsically connected to the meal afterwards. And therefore, there is room to debate if the Havdalah wine, bracha, is really connected to the meal that you plan on eating afterwards. And therefore, there's room to debate the decision. Tosfos himself says that I think this way, but the others argue that there's room to debate what he says, that maybe the wine of Havdalah possibly should not exempt the wine during the meal afterwards. So if you want to get out of all problems, either don't eat a meal immediately after, or have in mind that your wine is not exempting any wine that you're going to have during the meal. You're not planning on having wine during the meal. And then afterwards, if you change your mind and you have wine during the meal, you will need to recite a bracha, definitely. Otherwise, you're not sure if you need a bracha or not. It would create problems. So this is with the side Tosfos, this very long Tosfos over here that I've been sharing with you some insights from. Now, the Gemara that we're up to the next Gemara. Hayu Yeshvin Kolachad B'Yachad. This Gemara that we're up to is 7-8 lines from the bottom of the page. And it's going on the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that if they were sitting, each one recites their own bracha. If they're leaning, then one person recites the bracha for everyone. So if they're just sitting without leaning, then everyone needs to recite their own bracha because it's not called a kviya suda. It's not, you weren't kveya suda. But if they lean, then everyone is making this meal into a communal meal and they're eating together. Therefore, one person would recite the bracha for everyone. Now, we said in Taisvis, an earlier Taisvis, that nowadays we don't do this leaning, only on Pesach, but generally we don't do this. And therefore, when we eat a meal together, we all sit together. That would be maybe like at one table, that would be considered like their equivalent of their leaning. When we sit together at one table together, that would be like an equivalent of their leaning. So the Gemara here says, the Mishnah said if they were sitting each one, then they each recite their own bracha. But if they're leaning, one person recites the bracha for everyone, he exempts them. Hasebu in loy hasebu loy. If they're leaning, then that's good. They can exempt each other with the blessings. But if they're not leaning, then they can't exempt each other with the blessings. Minhu, and they asked a question from a brisa. And the brisa says that Asara shahayu holchem baderech, there's 10 people that are going on the way, they're eating together. Even if they're all eating from one loaf, everyone recites his own bracha. Yoshvu lechol, but if they sit down to eat, even though each one is eating from his own loaf of bread, they're not eating from the same loaf, they're eating from their own. But since they're sitting together, one person can recite the bracha for everyone. So this was a contradiction, because this means that you don't have to lean. You could exempt other people with your bracha when you simply sit down. Right? This brisa seems to say that when you're standing, you're going. So everyone, or they're just either standing or walking around, you got to say your own bracha. You're sitting down to eat. One person exempts everyone. So do you have to lean? Doesn't sound like it. Sounds like sitting down is good enough. Our Mishnah said you need to lean. So the Gemara answers, well, the Gemara it develops the question. Katani yashvu avabishal esebu. We learned in this brisa that if they're sitting, even if they're not leaning, it's good enough to be able to exempt everyone else with the bracha.
There are a bunch of meals and packages.
Okay, just muting everyone. Okay, so the Gemara says, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchok, you're going to Amri Nezel v'Nechal Lachma b'Duch Plon. We're dealing with the brisa talking about an interesting case, a different case than the Mishnah. The brisa is talking about a case where they all decided that they are establishing a place where they're going to sit together. So they said, Nezel v'Nechal, let's go and eat lachma, bread, b'Duch Plon, in that place. And because they prepared themselves, that is considered a kvios of establishing a meal. If they just happen to sit down, that wouldn't be considered a kvios, a established meal, eating together. But if they say, let's all sit down over there, then it's considered a established place. And that would be good enough to be able to be mitzi, to be able to fulfill the obligation of the bracha or the brachos, with one person saying them and everyone else saying amen. So we're dealing with both the first bracha and the end bracha. That you could exempt someone from the first bracha, and you could exempt them from the end brachas, from the brachas after the meal as well, and that's how we understood it. And this story, or this this case of the brisa, seems to be talking about they ate from one loaf, or from each one had their own loaf, and one person is reciting possibly the after blessing. Seemingly, it's talking about the after blessing for everyone. Now, Kinoch Nafshei de Rav, when Rav passed away,
Excuse me, Rabbi, what page are we on?
we are at the end of 42b.
42b, thank you.
So when Rav passed away, Ozlu Talmidav Basrei, his students went after him to be melave him, to escort him to burial. Now, Kihadri, when they returned, Omri, they said to each other, Nezel v'nechalach manahar danak. Let us go and eat bread the edge of the river Danak. So the commentaries talk about here that they used to fast on the day that their teacher passed away, but this was the burial was maybe the day after, and therefore they didn't fast. They were allowed to eat. Therefore, according to their tradition, they were able to eat because this was a day of burial, not the day of the passing. But so anyway, so they were going to eat on this river. Basar de Krachi, after they finished eating, from the word kairech, after they had their sandwiches, so to speak, Yasvi, they sat down, becoming bailahu, and they were wondering about our Mishnah. Our Mishnah was bothering them. Hesebu davka tanan, when the Mishnah says they have to lean, does it mean specifically lean? Aval yashvu loy, but if they sat down, is it not good enough for one of them to exempt the others? Or maybe, since they said, let us go and eat in this place, rifta v'duchta planisa, bread in this place, in the such and such a place, ki hasebu dami, that is considered like they have established a meal together, and it's like they are leaning. So the question is, was it good enough? And they were not aware of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchok's interpretation of the previous brisa that we just said, because we just learned that it's good enough. And one person could exempt all of them. So, loy hava biyadaihu, they did not have an answer in their hands. They weren't sure. They didn't know what to say. So, come Rav Adar bar Ava. Rav Adar bar Ava got up and now we turn the page. Hader chire la chire. He took the torn part of his garment that he had torn for his Rebbe that passed away, or for the great scholar that passed away. And he put it behind him. So it says, Hadar kire la'achire. He put his tearing behind him. V'kara kriach mina. And now he tore another tearing in front of him. And the reason he did that was because he felt that it's like a new death had occurred. What do you mean? What new death occurred? He had the death of the great Rav, but what was the new death that he's tearing another tearing for? And the answer is that they're missing out in the scholarliness of their Rebbe who passed away. And so he tore another tearing. Amar, he said, Noch nafshe de Rav passed away, uberkas mezayna loy gamrina. And we didn't learn from him. We don't know the laws of Brochos of food. Berachas hamazon, the blessing, the after blessing on food. Ad asahu saba, until an elderly man came, and Rama lahum asnisa brisa, and he said, the Mishnah says hesebu, and the brisa says that they sat down. And he says, it seems a contradiction. Vishani lahu, and he answered to them that the brisa is talking about kivan diamri nezel v'nechel achmav duchplan ke'asebudam. So he answered to them that to answer this brisa, you have to say that's not a contradiction. Normally, you need to recline, but if you set up a plan of where you're going to eat together, that is considered like you have reclined, and it's considered like an established meal together, a communal meal, and one person can bench for everyone. So kivan da'ami nezel nechel lachma duchpalan kasebudam. It's considered like they are leaning, and it's good enough. One person can exempt all of them, and because they are planning, they planned it in advance to go to that specific place. So that is the conclusion of that little piece of Gemara. Now, the next Gemara deals with this idea of leaning. And does it apply to wine? And to what extent? Would wine need leaning, or does it not matter? So we're going to have two different versions of the next Gemara. The Gemara brings two versions. The Gemara says, and they do seem to be at odds with each other. Hasebo echad mevarech l'kulam. So the Mishnah said that if they lean, one person could exempt everyone else. Amar Rav loishano ela pas. Rav said this only applies to bread that you need to lean. The boy haseba, because you need to have the leaning in order to unite everyone. Aval yayin loy boy haseba. Wine doesn't need leaning to unite the people. If they're drinking wine together, that's good enough. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Afilo Yayin Nami Bayaseba. Rabbi Yochanan says, nope. Even wine, you need to lean in order to be able to have one person exempt the other person. Now, what comes out from this is, or what this boils down to, I should say, is that Rav says that bread is considered something very significant, And in order to consider that you're eating a meal, a communal meal with others, you need to have the wine, you need to have the bread in a sitting of leaning in such a setting. Now, wine is not as significant. It's not so important. And therefore, wine wouldn't need that because wine is not such a significant food. It's not the main thing that the meal is established on. And therefore, if you don't lean, you're still sitting, you're still eating together, you're still drinking together. One person could exempt everyone else. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, wine is very significant. Wine is very important. It's an important food, important drink. And therefore, you need to have a seba for wine as well in order for one person to exempt others. Ika di Amri, now the Gemara says, but there are those that say that we have the version of Rav wrong, and it was a little different. Amar Rav said, Loishanu ela pas. We only learned that bread, de mahanya le haseba, that leaning works for bread. Aval yayin, but wine, loy mahanya le haseba, leaning doesn't work for wine. And even if they leaned, doesn't work. Everyone has to recite their own bracha. You can't fulfill the obligation by listening to someone else's bracha. It works for a mitzvah, but not for food. For food, you can't do it. For only wine, only for bread it works for. Bread, Heseba makes it work, but wine it doesn't work for. And even if they lean, it's not gonna make it considered like a meal and like a communal meal. And therefore, because everything else is temporary. Therefore, only for wine, only for bread will it work. Wine it won't work for. And that's Rav's. That's this version of Rav. So the previous version of Rav was very lenient, that you don't even need to lean. Wine you could even have someone else in mind, even without leaning. And this version of Rav is that even with leaning, it's not going to help. And Rabbi Yochanan argues, Rabbi Yochanan says wine leaning will work, and you'll be able to have one person reciting a bracha for everyone. I think Susan had a question before you, Ben. Susan?
No, Ben is before me.
Okay, Ben. Okay, Ben.
I wanted to ask, you said bread was a mitzvah. That's why you have to sit together.
I didn't say
wine is not a mitzvah.
meal.
What?
I don't think I said that because it's a mitzvah. I think I said because it's a meal. It's established. It's more of you establish a meal on bread. Everything else is less significant.
But wine, I thought wine is just as important as bread. It has its own bracha all the time, just like bread.
But it's
Those are the two
not
things that you do before the meal, is wine and bread.
Right, right.
So why is wine not working? It works the same as the bread.
So you like Rabbi Yochanan, I see.
Yeah.
Rabbi Yochanan says what you're saying.
Right.
Wine and bread is the same, falls into the same category. But Rav says no.
What's his reasoning? That's what I'm asking for saying no.
It would seem that although wine is considered a honorable food, but it doesn't compare to bread. Bread is what people's life depends on. But bread is a real meal. Wine is something special. In other words, we're not saying that wine isn't special, but we're saying that it's not a established communal affair unless you have wine, unless you have bread. Bread makes
bread is a bread is a staple. We have to have bread.
But what we're saying when it comes to a communal event, the bread makes it into a communal meal rather than just
but they never mention,
rather than just a smorgasbord where people are popping in and out.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
They never mention water for the meal, or they never mention juices. They always mention wine. That's the drink they drink when they eat.
Yeah, I'm not sure where you want them to mention the drinks. Where would you like it
because
to be
wine
mentioned?
is very central to your meal. The others are, they are not,
Central? I think water is probably more central than wine.
but they
to the
don't
meal.
mention it.
Well, why should we? Where do you want it to be mentioned?
When they mention a meal, they should say water is important for the meal.
Well, then we should include salt and pepper. I mean, where do you stop?
I just don't know why you would want them to mention it. You want to know if it's exempted? It is exempted from the bread. The bread includes all the drinks.
Yeah, I'm saying all the other drinks are exempt. Wine is the only one that's not exempt because it's very
Right.
important to the meal.
I don't know if because it's important to the meal, it's a very special drink, but
Okay.
not necessarily is it important. But anyway, the point here is that
We'll see where it
there's a lot of
goes. Yeah.
events. A lot of events people come to, but you wouldn't say that it's a meal together. If you want to say you're eating a meal together, you're eating together, that would be where you're having an official, something that's officially, you're sitting down together in a communal setting. And the question is, what makes that? Is wine enough of a communal setting to make it that, to reach such a criteria? Or does it need to be a bread meal? And that's the argument between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan.
So I think Yochanan is right because
We don't pick sides over here. We know they're both right, and we can't say. But you could say that I don't understand the other one, but you can't say
I don't
one is
understand
right.
the other one. Right?
Okay. Yes, Susan.
Okay, I sort of have, how can we establish a meal on wine? We don't. We only establish a meal with bread. Is that correct or not?
Well, it depends what you mean by establishing a meal. If you invite 10 friends over and you say, we are having wine, did you establish a meal on wine?
Not, I would never do that.
If
I
you
don't
did,
have-
would that be establishing a meal on wine? I don't know. What?
Not- I mean, I wouldn't do
Why not?
that
But if you did,
because
would
I
that
don't
be?
drink.
Yes or no?
I don't drink wine. I don't offer my
Right.
guests wine. But
Well, if you
I
did
always
drink wine,
establish a meal on bread, always.
if you drank wine and you invited 10 people over, you have to think about this. Would that be called establishing a meal on wine? It would. But the question of
Rebbe,
Gemara is,
what did Esther do for Achashverosh and Haman? So Mishtayayin.
so the question is that considered a communal setting, communal meal?
So
When
can I
you establish it.
speak to that?
So you could do that or you can't, whatever you want to do. If you want to, invite them over, but that doesn't necessarily mean that if you did that and you drank wine and you have your 10 guests, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is considered a communal meal setting. You know what I mean? You did invite them, you did have wine, but maybe yes, maybe not. It deserves to be thought about, and that's sort of a discussion here, Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. Would you consider that an established meal or not? So it's hard for you to relate to because you don't drink wine, but it doesn't change. The Gemara is not going to change the facts just because you don't drink wine. You know what I mean? You have to try to put your mind into the imagination
I don't
of what
think-
the Gemara.
I don't think the Jews established their.
It doesn't matter what you think. It matters what would happen if people did this. Would this be good? Someone could be mitzi them, could exempt them for the blessing or not. That's the question here. Can you exempt someone in such a scenario? So whether it happens often or it doesn't happen often, or people like it or people don't, the question is we have to know the law. So we can't just
I understand.
we can't
Okay.
just deal with the few people who are on diets. We have to concentrate on what would the law be for people who aren't on diets. Yes, Simone.
Yeah, so it seems to me that there are two situations here. And one situation is I have a wine tasting event at my house. I invite people. They have, in a sense, all agreed to be there. So one, I don't know whether I can do.
Just 1 second, Simone.
Yes,
Hello? Okay. And a carry on also, yes. Carry on, they don't wait. That's interesting. No, don't worry. They don't wait. Don't worry. Nothing for you. Okay. Okay, sorry about that. Yes.
okay,
Simone.
so I'm saying I have a wine tasting event at my house. Maybe I have grapes and cheese, maybe not. I invite people over. We have the intention that they're going to all be here together with me. So one person can say the bracha for everybody and exempt everyone because it's the same as leaning. It's the intention. The other situation is the local liquor store, kosher liquor store, has a wine tasting event.
Okay, you love to jump to two things so that I can't answer the first one.
They're connected. They're connected.
I know, but do you want to discuss the first one, or you want to pretend like it's done and you won?
No, I just want to put both scenarios
Just tell
out
me,
there.
if you want to win, we'll let you win.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
not a matter of win. Let me just tell the other scenarios. The local liquor store has a wine tasting event. People randomly show up. They have not intended to be there all as a communal group. Therefore, one cannot say the bracha and exempt them all. This is how I understand these two situations.
So let's talk about the first one. So so you're establishing a place where everyone's going to come together for the wine. So let's look at the Gemara. The Gemara said that for wine, Rav said, doesn't need this leaning. You don't really need to have such an established thing. You could exempt them. But Rabbi Yochanan said, even wine needs to have this haseba, which according to that, you sort of have because you're sort of establishing this place where everyone's going to meet together for this wine. So it sounds good according to the first view. Then if you look at the second view, second version of the Gemara, that Rav says that the leaning only works for bread. It doesn't work for wine. So it's not going to work in your scenario, according to the second version, according to Rav. But Rabbi Yochanan would say that it works even for wine. The haseba will work, which sounds like it would work also for establishing a place. Okay, so that covers your first case. Then the second case was where the store is inviting people for their wine tasting. And what was your thought about that?
I thought about that is that you cannot have one person exempt the other people because they don't have leaning or the intention that we're going to establish a meal together.
Well, why not? Their place is no better than your house. It's no worse than your house.
Well, it's not a matter of the house versus the store. It's a matter of people have come here with the intention of having wine together with me in my house. Whereas at the store, it's randomly whoever shows up. So that the intention there is the same as they're saying, let's meet together by the river and we're going to have a meal together. It's that idea of the intention of having a meal, establishing a meal together.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's an interesting point. You'd have to, we'd have to think about if the fact that they say, at this end of the store, when they make an announcement and say, in this end of the wine store, we're having the wine tasting, anyone who wants to come can come, would that constitute, within a location, within a place that possibly would make it established? Maybe not. Maybe your thought is correct that the fact that they're there anyway doesn't really work. Possibly, but some people might come specifically because they like the free wine. So those people maybe could be considered that they're coming special for this, while the other people, maybe you could differentiate between the two people. There's some people that are there, they don't read the news, they don't read the coupons, and they come there because they're buying wine. Other people are coming there because they want the wine tasting.
But
so
they
it could
don't
be
have
maybe
the intention of being together. It's not just a matter of I'm intending to drink wine. I'm intending to drink it together with these other people. That was my sense of what I'm reading in the Gemara.
So what you're saying is when you have a wine tasting event in your house, people are not coming to taste wine, they're coming to socialize. When you have a wine tasting event in a store, they're coming to drink wine and taste which wines they like. Is that what you're, the way you're?
That's a fair explanation, yes. Sir.
So there's probably some truth to that. Although there are some people who might come to your house simply because of the wine and not really to socialize with anyone. And
I wouldn't invite them.
You wouldn't invite them. Okay, that's another. I don't know you. Okay. All right. So then that might be a difference. But then again, there might be people also, the people who are going to the store. It could be that those are people who socialize and they're coming for the wine, not because they know wine. They don't know any wine. They're living in some hick town where they're not big into wine. They're simply coming for the socialization. So that might be that might knock off that logic. But anyway, it's an interesting thought. Yes, Isaac.
I think she is just distinguishing between where she has an event and invites people over, as opposed to when you go to Costco. There's a guy standing there with a table with 3 cups of wine. That's not any kind of event that anybody's planning. They're walking by and taking something. Right. I think that's what she means.
Yeah, no, it's true. The only thing is, if you go to the kosher stores, you sometimes get you get a feel of when, they have it every Friday morning. So the people who like the wine, they come there every time. They schmooze with the guy and they ask him, "Oh, do you have anything older than this? Is there anything a little, less dry and less this?" Right. So those type of people
make kiddush for everybody.
So anyway, but So it's good point. I'm just sharing that you'd have to.
Isn't it the point of the bond between the people? We have made a bond between us. We've made a connection between us.
So it definitely has something to do with that. It definitely has something to do with that, with this meal, the official meal of bonding together to be able to exempt. And the reason why that is, or tell Shana, the reason why that is because that you are eating your food. How are you exempting someone else? You're enjoying a different benefit than the other person. And therefore, in order to be able to fulfill the obligation for someone else, you would need to have something in common that you're uniting together in this sense of a socialization type of meal. And in fact, Ezra had asked on Friday about eating in a fast food restaurant, and you sit down and you want to know, can you bench a mazumin if you're not really sitting together, because the one guy is eating his slice of pizza, you don't know him from Adam, and you're across the table from him eating your falafel, and the other guy is sitting next to you, and he's doing his thing, and everyone's looking at their own telephones. So the question is, could you make a mazumin? And this is a big problem if you can recite a mazumin, because you really don't have in mind to have a meal together. So it's brought in Shulchan Aruch. They deal with this, and not in Shulchan Aruch itself, in the commentaries of the Shulchan Aruch. And I was looking it up on Friday because Ezra had asked it. And what it seems like is that if you're not facing the opposite direction, then you can bench a mazumin. But when you face the opposite direction, then you're totally not eating with the other person. So that's what we're trying to do, is to create some type of a feeling of uniting together, and that would allow you to be considered, some type of a communal setting, communal meal. Yes, Ezra.
I had a quick sort of comment on that.
Yeah.
For example, if I were to go with my family, which includes my son. So there's two of us. We're missing a third for a mezuman. And so this is the reason why I asked the question, because, there are times, you might go in, you say, oh, I have two, and hopefully I can find somebody from, at the restaurant to make the mezuman. So I have that expectation of maybe asking somebody to do that. All right. It's not as if I'm just coming by myself and I look around and I see two other people and I turn around and say, I think what I was saying, or the way that I'm feeling this, is that I have the majority of the mezuman with me. And what I'm looking is to have somebody come and basically complete it. So in that situation, that's the reason why I was asking that question. And also,
Right.
Moshe's been having his hand up for a while. So.
Oh yeah. Okay. Right. So your question about including someone else, I mean, the obvious thing would be if you socialize together, that would make more sense. That it should be for sure. You're sitting together and enjoying the meal together. But it seems from the source that I found in the Piskei Teshuvos, which is a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, he said that if they're not facing the opposite direction, it seemed that he was that's acceptable.
Okay.
So that's what it sounds like. Yes, Moshe.
Yeah, you've pretty much answered the question.
Okay.
No, I'm not finished. In a restaurant, I saw, I saw this happen. There was a guy who was sitting with his wife and his son, I believe it was, I don't know. And the table next to him, they said the Berei Priya Geffen, and he said, Hamotzi. And then he felt he was exonerated because they did it for him, and he didn't even know these people. So he helped himself he ate the bread, and he drank the wine, and of course, he didn't even know these people. It was in a restaurant, the table next to him, So, I just found it rather funny that, that actually happened. But he's not exonerated because he's not really, and he was actually facing. I mean, he wasn't facing. He was actually turned maybe away from them.
Right. Well, okay. So, in any event, I think the simple thing is if people, socialize together and they sort of establish a meal together, it probably would be advisable. It doesn't say that there, but it would just seem like that would be an easy way to connect. The other thing is, it is important. The next chapter deals with Zimun, so it's really connected to the next chapter of the tractate that we're going to learn hopefully after Pesach. That's Hashem. So it's really really connected to there. Yes, Ben.
What does it mean facing the other direction? Because if you sit with people around the table, some are facing one way, some are facing the other, and you do the zimun. Somebody is facing you, that's the opposite direction.
No. Facing each other or facing away? If they have their back to you or they have their face to you.
Okay, then they should call it facing away.
Yeah, let me read it to you. Let me see how it says it, because I just skimmed over it on Friday. It says a kvios is called when they sit on one table or one tablecloth. Even each one is eating their own food. Sudas mitzvah. Someone's inviting others. Even if they're sitting at different tables, they're considered like they're sitting at one table. They all join for one zimun. Even if each table doesn't have 3 people or 10 people. Now, what about yeshivas? They eat in one dining room, one time. So it's like they're intending to eat together, even if they're at different tables. They don't have 3. They can, if they don't have a set time to eat. So everyone just pops into the dining room and everyone just eats their meal and runs back to their learning. So 2 tables don't join together. unless they have in mind in the beginning of their meal to join.
Okay.
And restaurants, if people are sitting at different tables, or each family is at a different table and they don't have in mind to join, they don't join. If there's less than 3 people on one table, they don't join the zimun. That's in a different table.
Okay. So it's not whether they face the
We
other
have 3 at
way.
one table. One second, we have 3 at one table and 10 at a different table. They don't join that zimun.
Yeah.
If they're sitting at one table, 3 or 10, and if there are 3 people at a table, even though each one is eating and they have no connection to each other, they can join a zimun because the table joins them. So that's the.
Yeah, but facing the other way is not.
Just 1 second. Just 1 second. Unless they're sitting, they turn their faces away from each other. The opposite.
Away from each other.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Right.
then they don't join together, even if they're at
Right.
one table. So
Right.
the table joins them as long as they're not facing opposite directions.
No, as long as they're facing away from each other.
As long as they're not facing away from each other, right?
Right. Yeah.
Now, it also doesn't work if one is eating fleischiks and the other is eating milchiks. You
Oh,
can't do a zimun if you're eating something that they can't eat. Now, what about if you're standing? If you're eating standing, can you do a zimun? And what about if they say, let's stand here and eat? Does that work? So it depends. If it's a type of meal that you stand for, that would work. But if it's a meal that you should be sitting for and you're standing, then it doesn't. Then you can't do a zimun.
yeah.
So maybe for like hors d'oeuvres, if you were washing on the hors d'oeuvres and they're serving hors d'oeuvres, and they walk around the place with the franks and blanks and other types of things like that. With the if it's hamaitzi, they sometimes have little sandwiches. So that would be a situation where you would possibly be able to do a zimun. That's an interesting thing. Anyway, I'm just sharing with you from this sefer called Piskei Teshuvos. It's a sefer on the Mishnah Brura with a lot of later opinions. Okay, so bottom line is, did we finish up over here? It looks like we finished this little piece. Okay, we're gonna stop here. Everyone, have a wonderful day. Sei gesund.
See you later, Rebbe. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Rabbi.